Edmund Kemper stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a calm voice and polite manners, but behind that gentle facade was a man who murdered his own mother and buried college girls in the mountains. Known as the co-ed killer, Kemper didn't just kill. He studied his victims, outwitted law enforcement, and blended into society so well that even the police called him a friend. His story is one of intellect, manipulation, and a darkness so deep it shocked the world. Edmund Kemper didn't look like a killer. To most, he was just a towering, awkward man who kept to himself. But there was something about him that made people uneasy, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on it. He grew up in Burbank, California, born in 1948, and from the beginning, his life was marked by instability. His parents' marriage was turbulent. His father, a World War II veteran, eventually walked away, unable to cope with the bitterness and emotional abuse dealt by Edmund's mother, Clarnell. After the divorce, Edmund was sent to live with Clarnell in Montana, and that's when his world began to close in. Clarnell was not a nurturing mother. She often belittled Edmund, telling him he was worthless and would never amount to anything. She told him he was dangerous even as a child, and locked him in the basement at night away from his 2 sisters. He lived in fear and loneliness, surrounded by cold cement and darkness. While other children played outside, Edmund spent his nights staring at the shadows on basement walls, his mind drifting into violent fantasies. He began to fixate on death and power. He buried one of the family's cats alive. Later, he killed another with a knife. No one noticed these signs. Not the neighbors, not his teachers, not even his family. Or maybe they just didn't want to see. At school, Edmund was quiet, but he was intelligent, very intelligent. His IQ was later measured at 145, well above average. But that brilliance only made him more isolated. He didn't relate to his classmates. He didn't feel connected to anyone. The world around him seemed distant, almost unreal. His mind began to split. On the surface, he was polite and calm. Inside, he was seething with dark thoughts he didn't understand and couldn't control. By the time he was 15, Edmund couldn't take the pressure anymore. During a stay with his paternal grandparents in rural California, something snapped. He got into an argument with his grandmother and, without hesitation, shot her in the kitchen with his grandfather's rifle. Then, when his grandfather came home, Edmund killed him too. He said he didn't want him to see what had happened. He wasn't panicked or wild. He calmly called his mother and then the police. When asked why he did it, he said he wanted to know what it felt like. Rather than being tried as an adult, Edmund was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane. He was 15 years old and already a double murderer. But behind the secure walls of the hospital, something unexpected happened. Edmund charmed the doctors. He learned to mimic normal behavior by studying the prison staff and other patients. He memorized what they wanted to hear. Over the next 5 years, he convinced them he had changed, and just before his 21st birthday, he was released. No one knew it then, but the real nightmare was only beginning. When Edmund Kemper was released from Atascadero State Hospital in 1969, the world had no idea what it had just welcomed back. Doctors who once labeled him a dangerous schizophrenic now claimed he was fully rehabilitated. They praised his progress, intelligence, and cooperative behavior. He had been a model patient, respectful, articulate, even helpful in evaluating other inmates. But what they didn't realize was that Edmund had learned to wear a mask. He had studied the system from the inside and mastered how to appear sane. Upon release, he was placed back into the care of the very person who had fueled much of his inner rage, his mother. Clarnell had moved to Santa Cruz, California, and agreed to let Edmund live with her again. Their relationship, still toxic and cruel, picked up right where it had left off. She mocked his appearance, called him a failure, and accused him of being worthless with women. Though Edmund was now a grown man, he remained trapped in her shadow, still sleeping in a small bedroom in the house of a woman who saw him as a burden and a mistake. While trying to rebuild a life, Edmund earned community college and applied to become a state trooper. Ironically, he was rejected due to his size, At nearly 7 feet tall and over 250 pounds, he was considered too large to serve, but the officers liked him. He often visited the local bar, where many off-duty policemen gathered, earning the nickname Big Ed. He listened carefully to their conversations about ongoing cases, investigations, and the frustrations of tracking unknown killers. It was information he stored away quietly, like pieces of a puzzle. During this time, Edmund began collecting tools, items that would later become essential to his plans. He bought knives, handcuffs, a .22 caliber pistol, and learned the back roads of Santa Cruz County. He started cruising the highways in his beat-up Ford, watching the patterns of young women on college campuses. He observed how they walked, where they waited for rides, which areas were most deserted. Hitchhiking was common at the time, especially among students, and Edmund knew exactly how to appear trustworthy. He rehearsed how to approach them, polite, gentle, calm. The fantasy that had been brewing for years now had an outlet. In May 1972, he picked up 2 Fresno State students hitchhiking to Stanford. He drove them into the hills, over 100 miles away from their destination, then killed them both. Their names were Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa. Their remains would not be found for months. He kept parts of their bodies as trophies and returned home to his mother's house unnoticed. That killing marked the beginning of a spree. Over the next year, Edmund murdered several more young women, each time refining his technique. He buried evidence, cleaned his car meticulously, and never left behind witnesses. The police remained baffled, unaware that the killer they were hunting for was sipping coffee next to them at their favorite bar. All the while, Edmund returned to his mother's house each night, hiding his secrets behind a quiet smile and a locked bedroom door. The murders continued with chilling precision. Edmund Kemper had slipped into a pattern, one that fed both his fantasies and his need for control. Each new victim was selected carefully, and nothing was left to chance. He would cruise the highways, near university campuses, offering rides to young women who looked tired, distracted, or desperate to get to class. His voice was always calm, his demeanor disarming. Most saw a tall, awkward man who seemed safe, maybe a little strange, but nothing to fear. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. After picking up a victim, Edmund would drive them to a remote area, usually deep into the mountains or deserted back roads he had scouted in advance. He often used trickery to gain the upper hand. Sometimes he would pretend he had taken a wrong turn, feigning confusion, then park under the guise of checking the map or the car. That's when he would reveal the weapon, usually a gun or a knife, and take control. His size alone was intimidating. Resistance was futile. Once he had subdued his victims, the killings were often brutal and impersonal. But what came afterward was even more disturbing. Kemper would sometimes spend hours with the bodies, posing them, taking photos, even bringing parts of them home. He treated his victims not as people but as objects, pieces in a private, twisted ritual. He dismembered several of them in his mother's apartment while she was away or asleep upstairs. He hid body parts in closets, buried some in the yard, and disposed of others off cliffs or in remote wooded areas. Remarkably, no one suspected him. He maintained the appearance of a quiet, helpful man who occasionally mentioned how dangerous hitchhiking had become. One of his most daring crimes was the double murder of 2 roommates, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, in February 1973. He picked them up near the UC Santa Cruz campus, drove them past the campus security gate by showing his student ID, and killed them in the car. He brought the bodies home and dismembered them there. The sheer boldness of passing through security with 2 future victims in the back seat showed how confident and comfortable he had become in his role. Despite the growing list of missing women, local law enforcement had no leads. The murders seemed random. There were no connections, no reliable witnesses, no fingerprints. The public grew more anxious with each passing week, but investigators had nothing. Meanwhile, Edmund listened closely to every conversation at the cop bar. He learned what detectives suspected, what they overlooked, and how frustrated they were. He smiled, nodded, and offered sympathy, never once revealing the truth. By this point, the murders were more than just compulsion. They were a lifestyle. He no longer felt guilt or fear. He had created a world where he was the only one in control. But deep beneath the surface, the rage that fueled it all hadn't disappeared. It had only shifted. The fantasy was starting to change direction, and soon Edmund's next target would be far more personal than any before. By early 1973, Edmund Kemper had perfected the mechanics of murder. He had killed 6 young women, each time with growing efficiency and emotional detachment. But despite the control he exercised over his victims, there was one person in his life he had never been able to dominate: his mother, Clarnell. Their relationship had always been volatile, filled with resentment, psychological abuse, and a deep undercurrent of mutual hatred. She criticized everything about him, from his appearance to his lack of ambition, often mocking him for being unable to maintain relationships with women. She told him no woman could ever love someone like him. The emotional wounds she inflicted never healed. They festered quietly inside him year after year. By April of that year, the pressure had become unbearable. Kemper had been spiraling. His murders had grown more daring, and the thrill had started to wear off. But he realized that the person he had truly been building up to kill wasn't a stranger. It was the one person who had made him feel powerless his entire life. The final act had always been his mother. In his mind, all the previous victims had merely been practice for what he really wanted to do. One night, after a typical argument, Clarnell went to bed without another thought. Edmund waited until she was asleep. Then, with a claw hammer in hand, he entered her room and struck her repeatedly. Once she was dead, he carried out a series of grotesque and ritualistic actions, ones that revealed the depth of his hatred. He mutilated her body, decapitated her, and spoke to her severed head as though she were still alive. It was the culmination of years of rage, humiliation, and psychological torment. To him, this was justice, not just murder. But Edmund didn't stop there. After killing Clarnell, he knew the clock was ticking. People would come looking for her. So he devised a plan to mislead authorities. He called one of her close friends, Sarah Hallett, and invited her over to the house, pretending his mother wanted to see her. When Sarah arrived, he killed her too. He hoped it would look like the 2 women had gone on a trip together, buying him time to flee the state. He cleaned the house, hid the bodies, and packed his belongings. Instead of hiding locally, Edmund got in his car and began driving east. He passed through Nevada, Utah, and eventually reached Pueblo, Colorado. Along the way, he listened to the radio, expecting news reports about the double murder and a manhunt with his name attached. But there was nothing. Days went by in silence. No one had even noticed they were gone. In a strange twist of fate, that silence broke him. Edmund had expected a dramatic response, a race against time, sirens and helicopters. What he got was indifference. Sitting in a motel room in Pueblo, he finally picked up the phone and dialed the Santa Cruz Police Department. Calmly, he confessed to everything, every woman, every detail, every horror. At first, the officers didn't believe him. It took multiple calls before they realized he wasn't lying. Edmund Kemper had just turned himself in. The truth of what Edmund Kemper had done sent shockwaves through the nation. When the police in Santa Cruz verified his confession and entered his mother's home, they uncovered a scene beyond imagination. The remains of Clarnell Strandberg and her friend Sarah Hallett confirmed the horrific details Edmund had described over the phone. As investigators dug deeper, they began to piece together the full extent of his crimes. It wasn't just the recent double murder. He had been responsible for at least 8 killings, most of them college students who had vanished without a trace. Each crime had been carried out with eerie precision, leaving behind almost no physical evidence. During interviews with detectives and psychologists, Edmund gave chillingly calm and detailed accounts of the murders. He remembered every victim by name. He could recall what they were wearing, what they said in the car, even the exact locations where he had left their bodies. He described the murders not with emotion or regret, but with a kind of clinical detachment, as though he were recounting someone else's story. He spoke for hours without hesitation, volunteering information no one had even asked for. The more he talked, the more disturbing the picture became. He explained how he had used his charm and intelligence to gain the trust of his victims and avoid suspicion. He spoke about his fantasies, his need for control, and the twisted logic. He used to justify his actions. He even admitted to revisiting the crime scenes and keeping souvenirs. But underneath it all, there was a constant theme: his deep-seated hatred for his mother. Every act of violence had been, in some twisted way, a rehearsal for the one murder that truly mattered to him. When he finally killed her, he said it was as though a weight had been lifted. He felt at peace, even free. At trial, Kemper pleaded, not guilty by reason of insanity. But despite his gruesome past and history in a mental institution, he was found legally sane. The court determined that he understood the nature of his actions and knew they were wrong. In November 1973, he was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty had been suspended in California at the time, sparing him a place on death row. Inside prison, Kemper adapted quickly. He became known for his intelligence and cooperative behavior, much like he had in the hospital years earlier. He volunteered for tasks, helped in the prison library, and even recorded audiobooks for the blind. Over time, he gave numerous interviews to law enforcement and psychologists, providing insights into the mind of a serial killer. His words were often used in training programs to help investigators understand the psychology behind similar crimes. But for all his cooperation, the question remains: was Edmund Kemper born to kill, or was he the result of years of psychological torment and neglect? His story is a terrifying reminder that some of the most dangerous people are those who blend in, who appear ordinary, even helpful. Beneath his quiet demeanor was a man capable of extraordinary violence, a monster hiding in plain sight.